Hi, this is Tom Needham, and you are listening to The Sounds of Film. And I am so excited to have on the phone with us today Josh Rogin. He's a foreign policy columnist for the Washington Post and a political analyst for CNN. He recently had a very memorable appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience, and he went on there to talk about his important book, Chaos Under Heaven, as well as a lot of the news going on right now in the world related to the Wuhan lab. Josh, thank you so much for joining me today on The Sounds of Film. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, great to be with you.
Oh, man. Josh, before we get into your book and everything, I have to ask you, this past year, there was this major story that came out in Time magazine, which I'm sure you heard about. To me, it's one of the most alarming stories of the year. Time magazine had a story entitled The Secret History of the Shadow Campaign That Saved the 2020 Election. The article states that there was a well-funded cabal of powerful people ranging across industries and ideologies, working together behind the scenes to influence perceptions, change the rules and laws, steer media coverage, and control the flow of information. As someone who works for both the Washington Post and CNN, I had to ask you, were you aware that this was all going on?
I'm not familiar with the article that you're referring to.
Okay, well, it was Time magazine, and it got a lot of attention. Basically, the writer said that there were people in all different industries, including the media, politics, people from both sides of the political spectrum, labor activists, just a whole corporate CEOs, all working together legally to do everything possible to stop Donald Trump from becoming president.
You know, I've been working in major media organizations, each of them for the last 17 years, and it's obvious to me that kind of coordination is basically impossible because it's not the way that these organizations run. There is like a lot of groupthink, and there's a lot of follow the soccer ball to this side of the field and that side of the field, and there's a lot of basic incompetence. And if you told me that there was some corruption in some of these companies, I could believe that. But it's kind of like broad coordination doesn't happen because we're all meeting with each other. We all not really working together. And I think that while there's a lot of problems in the media and there's a lot of problems in the way that sort of corporations use their influence to steer our discourse, all of that I think is true. And I read a lot about in my book about how Donald Trump was actually treated unfairly at many times, like at many points by the media, especially with regard to how he was dealing with China. Some sort of big conspiracy I don't buy because again I've worked for all these organizations. They're not really competent enough to pull that kind of thing off. It's more sort of passive groupthink and general missteps that you find at different parts. And if you wanted to show me like hard data that some people were corrupt or that they steered it intentionally for corrupt purposes, I'd take a look at that. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. I'm just saying some sort of like overarching where the labor activists and the politicians and the media all work together and they have sort of meeting. I think I would have caught wind of that by now.
Well, I would recommend that you check it out. Like I said, this is not like Alex Jones or something. This is Time magazine, and they were bragging about it. And again, they weren't saying that they were doing anything illegal. They were just saying that they had a common enemy in Donald Trump, and they were trying to do everything possible to do good. The reason I bring it up to you is because I do know in your book and also on your Joe Rogan appearance that you said that one of the things that you've noticed over the past year, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so you can say it any way you want to do it, but that you noticed that when Trump was president, that it seemed for a while that anything he said, the press would just basically have to take the opposite side of the argument. And in one area in particular, which you've been making a lot of headlines on recently, had to do with the fact that when he said that the virus might have come from the Wuhan lab, immediately everyone said that that was a conspiracy, that that had to be wrong, or that it was, just offensive to Asian people. And, for people that haven't heard you speak on this topic, can you go into a little bit about what you discovered in terms of what's been going on this past year with the coverage of that particular story and what you broke recently?
Absolutely. I'm really glad you brought it up. Because similarly, I think this is one of those examples where, it's not like the head of CNBC and the head of the New York Times and, and the Bilderberg Group and and they all get together in a room and they're like, oh, we're going to say that the lab leak theory is not. That's not really how it works, at least from my experience, again, just being a guy who worked for 8 different mainstream media outlets over the course of 17 years, right? What I find is that it's more common that these organizations work in tandem because they're all sort of, failing in their basic responsibility to challenge their assumptions and to go against, be skeptical of not only, people like Donald Trump, but scientists and experts and intelligence officials and all the other sources that you run into as a journalist, who all have agendas, who all have some measure of conflict of interest, and who all think that they're, that they're the ones that are right and that they're the ones that are saving the world from the other ones. And, what we got by the end of the Trump administration is just there's a war going on. There was a few wars, but one of the wars was between, the mainstream media and the Trump White House, and aided by its own sort of media friends, and that consumed so many other important issues that a lot of the coverage became about the war between the two sides rather than the issue. And the China example is really one of the clearest and starkest and really was, troubling examples of this, because here you had a really important relationship that a lot of people inside the Trump administration were trying to work on very hard, and, they did a lot of good things, and sometimes it didn't always work out, and sometimes Trump said the wrong thing, and it wasn't perfect, but, by the end there, it was like whatever they said, there was going to be some sort of huge mainstream media backlash calling them liars, conspiracy theorists, and racists, and when the pandemic hit, that just got turned up to 11. So it wasn't just about the lab leak theory, it was about anything. If he said, the China travel ban was good, then the mainstream media would say it's bad. If he said it was bad, they would say it's good. And, everybody sort of lost their heads. It was a very confusing time. But when it came to the issue of, how did the virus start, which is really a really important question if you think about it, because it tells us what we're supposed to do to make sure that it doesn't happen again. How can you know what to do to change policy to prevent the next pandemic? You don't even know how this one started. And when that story became sort of a hot story in the spring of 2020, well, that just got caught up in all of our domestic partisan BS. And then the Chinese government came in with a mountain of propaganda to tell us that the lab had nothing to do with it. And then the scientists who were the best friends of the Chinese scientists, and these are American scientists who had a conflict of interest, they told all of their media friends that, if you say it was the lab, that it's a conspiracy theory. And put that together, and you put that with the Trump hatred that some of the media had, and you just had a perfect storm of just messy, terrible coverage of this issue. And then the mainstream media stopped covering it all. And for months and months and months, it was nobody had really even looked into it one way or the other. It was just sort of accepted that this was came from a wet market, even though, by the way, the Chinese government walked away from that theory. This is the Chinese CDC disavowed that theory, and but nobody noticed. But now, here we are, a year later. 592,000 Americans are dead. 3 million people are dead worldwide and counting, and we still don't know how this started. And all I've said from the very beginning, which, again, I sort of had a little bit of insight into because I was writing a book about the Trump administration China fraud, all I've said is that we need to investigate the lab. Okay? And just to say that was considered to be very impolite and could get you canceled and banned from Facebook until a week ago.
Yeah.
When all of a sudden the rest of the world was like, oh, wait a second, maybe we should investigate the labs. So now all I'm saying is we need to investigate these labs. Not because we know the labs did it, but because there's no circumstantial evidence that we can't rule it out. We can't rule it out. We got to investigate it. That's it. And that shouldn't have been a controversial thing to say, but it was until now when it's suddenly not.
Well, I still don't understand why it had to go to the extreme that people in the alternative press and even people in the mainstream media who dared to mention that it could have come from the Wuhan lab were getting canceled and deplatformed, and careers were ruined. But as you brought up recently on the Joe Rogan show, it's not just the story that is so controversial that it might have come from the lab. You also brought up that the funding for the lab may have come from America, from Dr. Fauci. And that's going to sound shocking to those people. I'm amazed. There's people I've spoken to just in the last couple of days who still don't understand this part of the story. For our listeners that haven't heard this yet, can you explain the possible connection between Dr. Fauci and the Wuhan lab?
Yeah, no, it's more than a possible connection. It's a connection based on evidence and data and documents. And, some of those documents are held in our government by the National Institutes of Health, which gave money to something called Eco Health Alliance, which gave money. And some of it is in the research that the lab produced itself, the research it did on that coronaviruses, which credited the NIH. Credited. In other words, they said in their own research, thank you for supporting our research, U.S. government, right? But what listeners should understand, and what people don't really realize, is that this whole industry of digging up viruses in the wild and bringing them to a bunch of labs that we built with those Chinese scientists who are such nice people, I'm sure. It's not their fault. They're trying to do good science. What we didn't realize is that by building all of these labs in China and starting hundreds of millions of dollars of research, and by the way, it's not just the NIH. The NIH is just one small piece of it. There's a USAID program for $200 million called PREDICT, and the number one investigator in China was Dr. Shi, the vet woman. She works as a Wuhan Institute of Virology, the head of their vet coronavirus program. She was getting USAID money, right? Then Eco Health Alliance, which is run by the guy named Peter Daszak, they were getting money from the DoD, from the intelligence agency, from the Homeland Security Department, and the National Science Foundation. And they built up an entire industry of playing around with viruses. And there were people at the time who said, hey, wait a second, maybe this is dangerous, maybe we should subject this to oversight. And these people resisted that oversight, okay? And they found a way to avoid the oversight. And then when the outbreak happened, these were the exact people that told us not to look at the lab. And then, when those people, the Daszak and Chachis of the world, told, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post that, hey, don't worry about the lab, it couldn't have possibly come from the lab. Of course, those journalists wrote that down because they'd rather believe scientists than Trump and Pompeo. But in this crazy one instance, it turns out that these guys had a conflict of interest. Fauci had a conflict of interest. He didn't want people looking into these labs because it points back to us, right? And that's why people, when they say, oh, well, we shouldn't look into the lab theory because it blames China. No, that's not right. There are people who are resisting it because it points back to us. We built that industry. We have this bet on China, and this is sort of the larger scope of my book, which is that if we just cooperated with them and engaged with them as much as possible, that good things would happen, and they would develop and liberalize economically, politically, we would live happily ever after, right? But it didn't work out, not because we didn't try, not because we just didn't have good intentions, but because the Chinese leadership doesn't think that way. They don't see it that way. They don't see our interactions that way. They mean us harm. The Chinese Communist Party, they are working against us, and they are taking our cooperation and our engagement and then turning it around and pointing it back at us. Or in this case, they took our scientific collaboration and then they built another part of the lab with the military, the part that they didn't tell us about. And this is the kind of stuff that goes on. So, it's not an indictment of these Chinese scientists, who I'm sure are really nice people, but they're not in control. They don't get to make the decisions. And if they did find out that they had been connected to the operation, they couldn't tell us. They would have to lie about it or be killed or jailed by their own government. That's how their system works. That's what we're dealing with. That's why we need to look into our labs, and we need to figure out what our people know. Because the Chinese government's not going to let us back into that lab probably anytime soon. So that means we got to start here. There's a lot of investigation we can do here. It starts with people like Fauci and Daszak, whether they like it or not.
There's so much to unpack here, but I'm just afraid that as we move forward, that the focus right now is on China, and as you said, we do have a part in this, and one of the things that I haven't heard a lot of people talking about yet, maybe you have, is that if we accept the fact, and I know you're saying that there's definite evidence, but once we accept the fact that we did fund the Wuhan lab and that Dr. Fauci clearly knew what was going on over there, it really invites us to go back and take a look at so many different things he has said in the last year, even unrelated to the lab, that just sounds so strange now. Like when he went on 60 Minutes and he told people to not wear masks. Like if he knew, like if he was intricately involved in the testing of these viruses over there, and he saw what had already happened in China. Like I know the excuse that they were saying that they were running short on masks, but he really doubled down and told people to like not wear masks. They're not even effective. And this was on 60 Minutes. And they could have told us to like put scarves around our house. We have around our mouths. We have a shortage. It could have been anything else, but it was just weird. And then when you go through like the whole year, like when he was telling people to not be concerned, to go on cruises, he was saying that we shouldn't close the airport initially to China. He didn't speak up for the journalists who were deplatformed for suggesting that it came from the lab when he knew that it might have. He let all those careers be destroyed. Like there's just so many different things. Like once we get to this point where we know that 100%, it becomes more common knowledge. When you look at all the different things he said through the past year, it's unbelievable. Do you have any thoughts about that kind of part of the story?
Yeah, I actually think there's a risk in like conflating too many things that may or may not be related to each other, because we're getting into an area where you want to be careful, you want to be precise, right? So, yeah, I happen to agree with you that telling people not to wear masks because you really are worried about the shortage of masks. In other words, he was lying to us to protect the hospital workers. I don't think that's the right thing to do. He shouldn't have done that. He should have been honest with the American people. If he knew that masks were good and we just had a shortage, then he just should have said that. But he told us not to wear masks. I think that's the wrong decision. Is that related to the Wuhan Institute of Virology? I don't really think so, because it's not clear what he knew about the virus at the time, except for the fact that he was telling us not to look into the lab. Now, keep in mind that at the same time, there was another guy in the first government, a guy named Robert Redfield, who was the head of the CDC, who believed this whole time that it probably came from the lab, but he didn't say anything. Okay, so Fauci was like the face of this thing. And he's saying, oh, don't worry, it probably wasn't the lab. What he actually said was, it doesn't matter if it was the lab. That's what he said in his interview, because it was still a naturally occurring virus and it wouldn't impact our response. Which I find to be crazy. Just think about that. What do you mean it doesn't matter? Of course it matters. If it's the labs were involved, then we're going to have to dismantle or at least re-examine our cooperation with all these Chinese labs. The cooperation that he helped set up, the cooperation that he helped to fund. So the conflict of interest of Anthony Fauci on the lab is, I think, pretty clear, actually. And he was only confronted with it once by I don't have like 5 minutes. It didn't go well, right? Because they got caught up in this semantic debate over what's gain of function. Is this gain of function? Is that gain of function? And Fauci has these very lawyerly answers. Now, is that related to Fauci telling us not to wear masks? Well, not really. You know what I mean? It's just a separate mistake that he made. And yes, if you want to line up all of those mistakes and say it forms a pattern of not doing the right thing during the pandemic, I could understand that argument, but I don't know that anyone really did the right thing. Everybody messed up. Trump made some mistakes. Inserting bleach. Everybody made mistakes. The media made mistakes. Nobody handled this stuff. But here we are in June. It's been 18 months, and still they won't tell us about their work with the lab. The congressional investigation mounting, asking Fauci and Daszak and all these guys to hand over all of their stuff. We want to see the documents. We want to see the contracts. We want to see the email correspondence. All right, well, you say nothing untoward happened. Well, forgive us, Anthony Fauci and Peter Daszak. We're not going to be able to take your word for it. We're going to need to see the actual papers, and that's the next phase of this thing. So rather than just thinking, oh, well, who knows who knew what when, we have to actually do the investigation. That means pressing the Chinese for access to their labs. It means pressing Fauci and Desic and all the rest of the American scientists who worked with this lab to tell us what they know. Hand over all the stuff. We want to see all of it. And I think that's essentially what's going to have to happen.
Well, one of the things that you get into in your book is about the rising threat of China and how it's such a complicated, nuanced story because American business is so intertwined with China in so many different ways, including the science community. You know, China not too long ago had that whole program with the I forget the exact name for it. You probably know the 1,000
talents.
Yeah, I mean, it's so depressing. It sounds like every day we find out that either scientists or engineers or politicians or journalists. I mean, it seems like they've been giving money to everybody. And then you have Wall Street, which you get into, who is just so obviously heavily invested in all kinds of businesses that deal with China. And then even every U.S. corporation has manufacturing plants over there. I mean, I brought up a lot of different things here, but out of some of those different areas, the science, the corporations, what are some of the problems that we have now in this country in terms of China being in our business?
Yeah, again, I think I understand exactly what you're getting at here. We have this, again, sort of 50-year bet that if we just, intertwined our economies as much as possible, that good things would happen. We didn't think about what would happen if they weaponized that engagement against us. And, what the Chinese Communist Party has done is they've taken each piece of that engagement with our universities, our tech companies, our Wall Street firms, Hollywood, sports, you name it, and they found ways to abuse it to advance their political interests, not to advance the interests necessarily of the Chinese economy, to advance the Chinese Communist Party's political agenda. And that agenda is to make the world fit for repression and autocracy and to make us shut up about their atrocities, including a genocide in Xinjiang, including the crackdown of Hong Kong democracy, including threatening Taiwan. Don't even get me started on Tibet. And what they want is to compromise us by having us so dependent on them economically that we can't stand up to them politically and diplomatically. And the way that they do that is by throwing money into all of these institutions on both sides of the aisle as much as possible. And Wall Street is the worst one because Wall Street guys are doing it on both ends. They're getting paid on both ends. In other words, they're spending by China and allowing the Chinese government to expand in our own country and our society with no oversight. And this has been going on for decades. Nobody's watching it. Nobody knows how much money is going through. We have these supposed protections, export-import protections. They're like Swiss cheese. And what we find when push comes to shove is that the Chinese Communist Party is getting more and more sinister in the way that they abuse these relationships. Look at the NBA. One tweet. The guy sent out one tweet. They punished them to the tune of $400 million. Right? That's a $400 million tweet. What's next?
Yeah.
How far are we going to let this go? Are we going to let a genocide, be perpetrated on our watch because we're too scared of our 401k getting tanked by the Chinese companies losing money, the companies that built the concentration camps or the cameras on the walls or that shipped human hair to us by the boatload? That's what we're talking about. Those are the stakes. And, the worst thing that we can do is do nothing. And people will say, oh, well, we can't confront the Chinese Communist Party because it's going to hurt our bottom line, or we're going to start a Cold War, or we're going to start an oil war. But actually, the thing that we're doing, which is not responding to them, that's the thing that's making it more dangerous, in my view. That's the thing that's making them more aggressive, and their appetite only grows with the eating.
Well, it's really gotten to the point, and I get this sense after reading your book that it's almost difficult now at a high level to have any kind of serious discussion about what America should do in the sense that, can you really trust anyone anymore in terms of like their opinion, if they're just saying that it's wrong to do something to pull out of China, or it's wrong to penalize China, because you just start to wonder now, like, who's compromised, and is there anyone left who's not compromised?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, there are. I mean, listen, for example, when it comes to the genocide against the Uyghurs, right? It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. It doesn't matter if you live in a blue state or a red state. It doesn't even matter if you like Trump, you hate Trump. You're probably against genocide, right? If you're not against genocide, you're probably compromised, right? So, and that's just, I mean, there's 100 examples, but that's just the easiest.
But we're not doing anything about it. Like, we've been hearing about this genocide for the last, year or two.
Well, you're right.
And like, we hear, like, think about if it was the Holocaust. I'm not saying they're exactly the same, but like, if people heard about the Holocaust and they're like, I'm against it, but we're not going to do anything to stop it. It's like, is it enough just to say I'm against it?
No, I mean, I don't see how you could go to the Olympics in Beijing and pretend that you don't know there's a genocide going on in that country. How does that work? How does that not make you sick to your stomach? That's just one thing, But no, I mean, the whole world is failing the Uyghurs and failing to stand up for Chinese human rights for lots of different reasons. Partially because we're caught up in our own partisan infighting. Part of it because, there's no financial incentive. But I think that's also changing. Like, look what happened after the NBA. The Chinese Communist Party. There was a backlash.
Yeah.
They actually suffered some pain on our end because people were like, oh, wait, that's really screwed up. You can't do that in NBA. And so I think the thing that has to happen, and this is why I wrote the book, by the way, is that the American people have to wake up to this. Okay, we have to talk about it. The fact that you and I are having this conversation, that is the answer. That is to educate people, not in a partisan way, not in a way that fuels hate, not in a way that fuels division. Just to say that we all have a common problem. And it's a complex problem. We're going to need complex solutions. We're going to need to talk about them out loud. Whether the Chinese Communist Party likes it or not, guess what? They're not going to like but that's...
It's funny, in the past couple of years, it's, a society now that we live in where everyone is being canceled for not being woke enough or whatever, and maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's not. People have different views on that, but that's the world we live in now. People get criticized for being on the wrong side of different ethical issues, and yet there doesn't seem to yet be an environment where people can criticize a corporation for doing business over there, for having their manufacturing over there, and maybe even using the labor from these camps and things of that sort. Don't we have to get to a point perhaps where it's just no longer okay for a business to be over there unless things change?
I mean, my personal view is that people need to educate themselves, but the truth is most people are very busy. And there's a pandemic happening, and people have their own problems in their own lives without worrying about the fate of Uyghur Muslims in the most northwest part of China. That's why I really think it is the U.S. government's job to sanction and tariff these guys until they stop committing genocide. Okay? Because until with your individual decision not to buy that sneaker or that nature shirt, that's not going to be. I'm not saying don't do that. I'm not saying you shouldn't exert the power of your dollar to oppose genocide. I try to do that. I'm not perfect, but I try, right? But in order to actually influence the Chinese government, we're going to need our government, our society to mount a much bigger response, okay? And then hopefully with allies, right? So look at the Olympics. What if, does our government even care about, the fact that we're going to have an Olympics in the middle of the country that's and if so, why haven't they said anything about it? And if they do, why haven't they gotten all the allies to go? You know what I mean? So without the will of our leaders, and without America leading the world, it's going to be impossible to confront this, because what we're dealing with is a superpower run by a cartel, by like a mafia family.
Right.
Like the Gambino's owned a country, right? With unlimited resources and no moral compunction whatsoever, no limit to the depths that they will go to advance their interests, which is to survive and to grow the party, not just for the benefit of China, but for those ruling corrupt elites in China. And so as it stands, the U.S. government is really the only entity in the world that's more powerful, if it still is even, we don't even really know. But it hasn't kicked itself into action the way that it needs to, and so I think that's the next step. That's what has to happen, and I think if America leads, the world will follow.
Josh, I know we have to wrap this up, but I'm so curious, as someone who has had a long career writing, you're on television all the time, you're on CNN, and you've been on all the other cable channels as well. But you were just recently on Joe Rogan, and we live in a different age now where like one appearance on Joe Rogan, one episode of Rogan can sometimes reach like 30 million people, and a night on CNN sometimes is 1 million people. I was wondering if you've noticed at all the difference in the impact between the different types of things that you do, whether it's writing a column or going on CNN or being on Rogan.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, releasing a book in the middle of a pandemic is not ideal, but it taught me something. Because I've been doing a lot of radio and a lot of podcast shows like yours, where I'm reaching people and meeting people and interacting with people who don't watch CNN and who don't read the Washington Post and who aren't following me on Twitter. And otherwise, I would never have this. It's a two-way interaction. I get as much from these things as I give. And, I'm one of those people who think that, like, we all have to follow the same media, or that there's one thing that's right and one thing is wrong. I think we should have all of these. We should have Joe Rogan, we should have CNN, and people can have us both, or one or the other, or whatever you want. That's the beauty of our country. You don't have to choose. I watch CNN and I listen to Joe Rogan, and I'm on both of them. You know what I mean? And what I sort of regret is that the mainstream media that I've worked in, that I built my career in, has lost a lot of people. All right, and there's a lot of complicated reasons for that. But that doesn't mean we can ignore all those people, all those millions and millions of Americans who we still need to talk to. We need to engage in the marketplace of ideas. So, yeah, when I was in the Joe Rogan episode, it wasn't about a bunch of new people just finding out who I am. It was about me getting in touch with a bunch of new people, and all of a sudden I had developed these new relationships and interactions that nurtured my intellect and my mind and made me a better communicator and a better journalist. So it goes both ways. That's why I was really happy that you reached out to me, and I'm really happy to do this show because, we got to talk to each other, even if we don't agree on everything. It's okay. We can disagree with each other sometimes, too. That's part of the American experience, too. And, we just got to get out of our bubbles, and we got to, get off of our teams, and we all got to, talk to each other so that we can all, live in one country and one society again.
Well, I totally agree. And you must have some special social skills because, as you mentioned, this is the year of everybody getting canceled. And I don't know how you did that Joe Rogan show at the time when you did it. I don't know either,
to be honest.
And then, I don't know how you went on CNN because, I watch CNN too.
I'll be honest with you.
But
all I do, I just tell the truth. I try to be honest with my viewers and my readers. And, try to be careful with my reporting. But yeah, I'm very lucky that I get to talk to lots of different types of people, but I think we need more of that.
Yeah.
I think we need to get out of our cones, and we got to start talking to each other again. We got to put this country back together. I have to be part of that. I'm glad that you are helping to do that.
Well, I appreciate that, Josh, and thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm going to recommend to all of our listeners to check out Josh's book, Chaos Under Heaven. Look for him on CNN and read his column in the Washington Post. Josh, do you have a website or anything like that you want to direct people to, or anything else you want to promote?
No, that's it. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, Josh, it was really a pleasure, and keep on doing the good work that you're doing and talking to everyone, because I agree with what you're doing, and I think it's great.
Thank you so much.
All right, take it easy. Bye-bye.